The list of injustice and atrocities run long. Broken treaties, hate crimes, racist legislation, and schools designed to erase culture have plagued Indigenous and First Nation communities across the United States and Canada since the turn of the 17th century. Of the many wrongs, the creation and use of boarding schools, also known as residential schools, beginning in 1831 and lasting dishonorably through 1996, woefully extended Indigenous oppression into generations lost. The federal governments of the United States and Canada, alongside churches, created residential schools to replace Native culture in Indigenous and First Nation children with white, Christian, English language ideals. Under the guise of education, these residential schools suppressed communication and publicly misconstrued what really happened behind school walls: racism, kidnapping, abuse. Children 4 to 18 were prohibited from using their native languages and had limited contact and communication with their families, leading to an irreparable cultural loss with lasting impacts on Indigenous communities today. Indigenous peoples lived and thrived in North America for centuries before the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century. As colonist populations rapidly grew over the next centuries, their communication barriers and unwillingness to understand cultural differences resulted in conflict between settlers and Indigenous. In Canada, First Nation tribes were all stripped of their rights under the Indian Act of 1867, which gave the Canadian government the right to create any legislation regarding First Nation tribes. Acts such as these were often backed by Christian missionaries and intended to erase Indigenous culture and assimilate them into the European way of life. In the United States, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1851 established reservations across the country. The government cared little of the conditions within, where food was sparse, warring tribes were confined together, and many died from starvation or disease. Early Canadian residential schools were operated by federally funded Christian missionaries. From 1831 to 1835, the Anglican Church of Canada operated the first residential school for First Nation children, the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario. In 1879, Richard H. Pratt operated the first residential school for Indigenous children in the United States, the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. As founder and superintendent of the school, Pratt is known for the phrase, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The purpose of residential schools was to make Indigenous peoples embrace Western values and Christianity. Missionaries believed that the most efficient way to do so would be through the Christian church. Spirituality and religion, important parts of Indigenous culture and identity for Native youths, were destroyed as schools indoctrinated Indigenous children with an alien religion. Without clearly understanding the true objective, Indigenous and First Nation parents were misled into enrolling their children, hoping for a basic education. There was little public knowledge of what actually went on within the schools, as the government purposefully blocked communication between students and the public. By the time the reality of these schools' intentions revealed themselves, governments were forcibly removing children from their homes by sending missionaries, police, and Indian agents that would continue to take children until each school was filled. Oftentimes, rations were withheld from families until they agreed to let their children be taken away. You know what the Mounties, the priest, the Indian agents told me? They told me if I resist too much, then they would take my younger brother and younger children. It was not a choice. Behind the walls and barred doors, Indigenous children were brainwashed and deprecated. Children were forced to cut their sacred hair into identical bowl cuts, wear uniforms, use English names, adopt Christianity, and only speak English, a foreign language that most did not know, which limited their ability to communicate. Children were severely punished with beatings or mouthfuls of soap if they were caught speaking their native languages.
Got strapped. I got beaten up for speaking my own native tongue. I even had my tongue pulled out and pinched.
They went to work and cut off my braids, which were a token of mourning. The closer the relative, the closer the cut. After my haircut, I wondered in silence if my mother had died, as they had cut my hair close to the scalp. Corporal punishment was common in many cases. Students faced physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and being separated from their families took a toll on their mental health. A sister, a nun, started talking to me in English and French and yelling at me. I did not speak English and didn't understand. She started hitting me all over my body, hands, legs, and back. I began to cry, yell, and became very scared, and this infuriated her more. She got a black strap and hit me some more. Between 1831 and 1996, there were over 180 residential schools and 210,000 students in Canada and the United States. With so many children forcibly taken away, Indigenous communities suffered. They missed their children, whom they saw as little as once every few years.
They took a lot of the labor away from families because families counted on their kids to help, especially with the sheep.
Students in residential schools received inferior education. Instead, they were trained for manual labor in agriculture, woodworking, laundry work, and sewing. They were forced to upkeep the schools with involuntary unpaid labor by scrubbing miles of floor, cooking daily meals, and farming. Along with disgusting sanitation, overcrowding, and inadequate food and health care, schools were severely underprepared to take care of the children. By the time students turned 18, most were academically in 5th grade, thus lacking skills to join the white working society. The assimilation ideal failed while simultaneously alienating the young adults from their own communities and cultures. Rather than learning arithmetic and reading, residential schools instilled a sense of self-worthlessness in the students, contributing to mental illness, depression, addictive behaviors, substance abuse, suicidal behaviors, and even intergenerational trauma. I learned the fear, how to be so fearful at 6 years old. It was instilled in me. I was scared and fearful all the time, and that stayed with me throughout my life. The inferior residential school buildings impacted the children's general health and increased the rates of chronic and infectious diseases. Reportedly, 24% of previously healthy children died in the schools as a result. With contact between child and parent prohibited, the cruel suppression of communication extended even into death. Oftentimes, parents were not alerted of their child's passing until after an unceremonious burial in a school cemetery.
When the little girl died beside me, I was scared why the parents were not there. They were never notified.
Stripped of a childhood, family, language, generations of Indigenous families were broken. Victims that lacked adequate parenting skills after experiencing abuse from a young age can sometimes reflect this behavior on their children and family members. Many descendants of the residential school survivors shared the same burdens as their ancestors, even if they did not attend the schools themselves. Over 19% of Native Americans reported having a mental illness in the past year. Generational trauma, comprised family systems, and a loss in native language, culture, and the irreplaceable teachings from one generation to another resonate today. The Canadian government has taken steps in making reparations for the atrocities committed against Indigenous people in residential schools, including financial compensation to former students, an apology to all former students from Prime Minister Stephen Harper, designating 2 former residential schools as National Historic Sites, and recognizing the residential school system as an event of historic significance in Canada. As for the United States government, President Barack Obama signed off on the Native American Apology Resolution in December 2010. However, there were many issues with the bill as it did not make a direct apology on behalf of the government, and there was no mass public coverage. Residential schools are a devastating example of how bias and racism prevent understanding and communication, with irreversible consequences on generations after. Indigenous communities still face harmful stereotypes and discrimination, which is why conversations of systematic racism continue. It falls upon the government to make formal recognition and apology, and include Indigenous voices in discussions of reparations. It is imperative we do not forget the racist history of our world, and instead continue to educate younger generations to do better than generations past. The key to understanding one another is communication, no matter how we differ, and the understanding that communication brings is being able to share knowledge, even of painful and shameful parts of our collective history. This allows us to acknowledge the mistakes we've made as a nation and confront the lasting consequences to finally begin to make amends to those harmed.